Just introduce Ben. He's the founder and director of Urban Foundry, has doctorate in creative regeneration of cities and over 20 years of experience in regeneration. He's our most local speaker, local to Carmarthen, working out of Swansea. And Ben's approach is one that uses creative thinking combined with a strong sort of theoretical background and understanding to solve a range of problems within town centres. So Ben's going to talk to us about remaking great places. So thank you, Ben. Over to you.
Lovely, thank you very much. So good morning, everybody. So I thought I'd focus really on why places work, or how, at least how they should work to create sustainable town, and heritage towns and historic city have a great deal to tell us about how that works. So there are 5 core principles that I wanted to cover, and a lot of this was, none of this is new. This is in fact, Jane Jacobs was writing about this in the 1960s, and many people have written about it since in varying ways, and you'll find different ordering and you'll find different sort of ways of explaining it, but it comes down to the same sort of 5 core principles. And the first one about kind of making great places is about having mixed use, one of which must be residential. Now, ideally, you want more than 2, but you certainly want at least 2 uses in a space. And the classic one, this is a very old picture, so it's a bit pixelated, but the classic one of this I always point people to is Greenwich Village in New York, where you can see you've got the flats above and the thriving shops below, and actually huge land values in these sorts of places. Nevertheless, relatively small businesses are thriving and operating and making life work economically as well as socially in those places. If you've watched the TV show Friends and the coffee shop in the basement, why does the coffee shop work? Well, it's because they all live above it. There's people who can walk to it, who can get to it really, really easily. I'm going to spend more time on some of these principles, less on others. And if anybody wants to ask any questions, we can sort of dwell on them at the end. The second one then, which I'll perhaps spend a little bit more time on, is having short perimeter blocks with what we call active frontages. And active frontage is the idea that wherever you are around that block, there's something at ground level, certainly, and ideally certainly above ground level as well, but certainly at ground level. There's something facing you. There's windows, there's doors, there's places where you can be overlooked, and ways in which if it's commercial, you can engage with that activity. Things aren't tucked away. You haven't got blank facing. And historic cities, that's Barcelona, you can just see it from an aerial view. You can see this kind of fine grain, this grid system of blocks, where to get to your destination, you shouldn't really have to take certainly no more than 3 turns, sometimes 2 you can do it in. And you can do that by wandering along the streets and weaving your way in and out of the blocks. As Paris is based on very sort of similar sorts of principles. A lot of this has vanished in the UK because so much of the UK was flattened in the Second World War, and when it was rebuilt first and foremost thinking about cars rather than about people and how people move around space. But the basic fundamental principle is relatively short blocks and easy to navigate through. At a smaller scale, this is not far from where I live, Uplands in Swansea, and again you can see that it's based on this grid system of blocks. And on the right-hand side, you can see where it starts to break down a bit there with a more modern, not modern, but modern for the time that it was built, slightly more spaced out space there, where it's actually a bit more difficult. But in certainly all of these areas, in the main shopping streets where you can see that red circle there, that's where it is. And you can see that in this grid section, 1, 2 turns, and you're into the middle, wherever you are, 3 at the most. And Uplands is absolutely thriving, and it's in fact some of the land values in Uplands, which is a sort of second-tier district centre, are now higher than they are in the city centre in some situations because of that fine-grained grid system and a good mix of uses within that space, with lots of residential, commercial, and some cultural function there as well. Contrast that with Morriston in Swansea, which is in the north of Swansea, if you don't know. And this is the original plan for Morriston. Morriston was one of the first planned towns in Wales. Again, you can see built on a lovely grid system of, this is from the tithe map from when it was first built. The original town was this little bit down in the right, and then on the cross there with the church in the middle. That was the sort of second phase of it. But Morriston now is struggling, even though it was based on that. And the reason for it is that's the plan of what Morriston looks like now. And if you can see my cursor, it's there. And if you can't see my cursor, that diagonal line on the sort of right-hand side of the picture is a great big dual carriageway, which has gone straight through the original town that was built there, which has long since vanished. And it basically has bypassed the town centre. So even though you've still got the grid system of streets, it's shifted the centre of gravity away from it, and all the passing traffic now goes through it. The same has happened in a lot of our valleys towns. So it's great if you want to get to your destination in a car. It's nice and quick. But actually, for the commercial vitality of those town centres, it's completely killed those town centres, because you've lost all of that pass-by trade. Those people who pop out for a packet of crisps, or if you've got a bad habit, pop a packet of cigarettes or whatever it might be, or a drink. And so respecting that kind of historic form of the town is something that frequently we've overlooked in our town centres and city centres in Wales, and actually in the UK more generally, because we've increasingly based things around planning for cars. And you can see it in a lot of our sort of external modern post-war developments. So this is to the north again, a lot of my examples from Swansea, because that's where I'm from. This is to the north of Swansea, and this is a modern post-war development in Blaenau Maes. And what you can often do with this, you just colour in the roads, and it's called a figure ground. And you can see the sort of there's one centre here at the bottom, and then there's a new centre here in Blaenau Maes. And if you take away the map, you can just see that actually you can't connect to anything. All of these roads have got dead ends, and you can't sort of connect to things. So actually it makes that 2 or 3 turn thing completely falls apart. And the commercial centre in the area, there's enough people living in that area probably to support the shops, but actually the shops are struggling, they can't survive. You end up with a lower socioeconomic demographic being concentrated in that area, and then consequently, commercially, the whole thing breaks down. But it's also important that the connections where they do exist are good quality connections. And you can see a little rogues gallery here of ones which are not good quality connections. They're alleyways, they're tunnels. And this is difficult sometimes if they don't already exist in historic town centres. Often they end up taking these sorts of forms of tunnels or little alleyways that have been shoved through. Sometimes you get this in more linear places, perhaps that have been built on a riverside or whatever. It's quite hard to cut through historically. And then as more modern building techniques come through, and they've built bridges and various other things, they found they have to punch holes and things to get through, which can't be very big, but then the quality of those connections becomes a problem. And so that's where you get naughty stuff happening. That's where people get mugged. It's where you get graffiti. It's where you get people relieving themselves late in the evening after they've had a few drinks and can't find the public loo or whatever it might be. And so the quality of the connections is also really important. The third key principle then is density. And the really important thing with density is that we've got plenty of people living within a 5-minute walk, 10 minutes at most, of our commercial centres. And again, historic towns are generally pretty good on this in terms of their historic built form. And the idea of that 5 minutes roughly, if it's flat, is roughly 400 meters. 10 minutes about 800 meters. If you've got a hill in the way, it goes down a little bit, but it's roughly that. And you can draw a circle, and within that circle, you should be finding enough density of population to support the commercial centre. And that density of population should be able to get there if they're reasonably able-bodied. They should be able to get there on foot or by cycle. They shouldn't have to jump in a car to go and get a pint of milk. They should be able to service their basic daily needs within that 5 to 10 minute walk. Again, this is the same examples I showed you earlier on, where you go into more modern housing estates and sort of developments. This is where it starts to break down. So you've got these are 400-meter walking circles, the blue circles there. You've got one centre here at Creu, which is kind of okay, but you can start to see there's some gaps in it. It's relatively low density. And again, that one I showed you earlier on in Blaenau Maes, you look at all of these gaps that are in there, and there is just not enough density within that circle to provide that social and commercial vitality for the centre. It's not just for the shops, it's for the community centre, it's for the civic functions as well. You've got to have enough people to support those activities. And what often happens then is you get this yellow type of circle, which is because it's crumbling and it's falling, the private sector's trying to sort itself out with a new centre, but actually it doesn't work for anybody. And so it's off the centre, which means all the people who've got to get in the car to go and get there, and it creates difficulty. And it's often easy to say, well, that's just theoretical stuff, it doesn't work. This is Reiselfeld in Freiburg in Germany. That is a city that is roughly the same size as Swansea. This settlement is roughly the same distance from the centre as that one I've just shown you in Blaenau Maes, and yet look at the density that they're getting in here, and it's socially and commercially thriving. And so actually you can do it. It's not about, oh, well, we're not New York, we're not Paris or whatever. You can do it in terms of smaller towns and cities as well, of get that density. And that's where the current idea, which is very, very poorly theorized, but the idea of this 15-minute city or sometimes 20-minute city that you're hearing people come out with, a lot of people aren't really defining exactly what they mean by that, but it's the same basic principles. The idea is that you've got what you need within a sort of 5 or 10 minute, really. I'd be saying a 15-minute in a big city maybe, but where you've got good public transport. But in a town or the cities of the scale of certainly that we've got in Wales and much of England, 5 to 10 minutes actually is what we should be aspiring to. Fine, if you're in London, we might be looking at 15, or Birmingham, but everywhere else we should be aspiring to 5 or 10. The The fourth one, which then is a key principle, is the varied age and use of buildings, and that's the yield of the buildings is often spoken about in that sort of context. And what's that's about really is about if all of the buildings are all of the same age and of the same type and the same condition, they're all going to be commanding the same amount of rental per square foot. And actually, what you don't want is large building users dominating space. So great big modern private developments distorting space, because often modern development now is working on a yield of 10 years, sometimes even down as little as 4 or 5 years. And if you're not familiar with yield is basically the idea of how quickly do you want to make your money back. So if you build a building for £1 million and you have a 10-year yield, then you want to be getting back about £100,000 a year in rental off that building. And after 10 years, it's effectively paid for itself, plus a little bit of interest. Some buildings sometimes with development, maybe not at the moment, but in modern eras have actually been on for 25% yields, where they're actually trying to make their money back in 4 years. Contrast that with historic town. The Victorians were building things with 150-year yields. And so actually, therefore, the rentals they need to command, it might not be what they want to command, but what they need to command from those spaces is much, much lower. And what they're really then looking at is a regular, stable income to keep things ticking over, rather than having to get these huge land values back, which of course then prices most of the local foundational economy out of the market. And that's a big problem that we then often have in our town centres, and the reason for so many vacant units. And historic towns often don't need those high yields. They might want them, but they don't necessarily need them. I was going to talk a little bit in relation to that then about one of the ways you can distort that is by using meanwhile spaces. And I know a couple of people have already talked about this morning, so what I won't do is talk about what the impacts of meanwhile spaces are, or perhaps the mechanisms of them. I'll just throw you a couple of examples of ones that we've done here in Swansea as a pilot project. And so taking big old empty spaces, some of them and some of them little spaces, and actually starting to do interesting things in pop-up, which is quick, it's just fast, it's light, it's cheap. So things ranging from getting pop-up activities from music and street food into spaces, to activate them to get kind of crowds of people to come in, and sort of early evening economy in this case. And what we wanted to do was to try and get people with children to come into town centres, so it wasn't completely dominated by an 1830 drinking audience. Through to running pop-up classes. We built a pop-up park into a space, and we ran yoga classes and well-being club spaces, and then we've had live music pop-ups. Taking rather bland sort of infills. This is one which is right next door to a conservation area in Swansea's town centre. So you've got a lovely bit of historic town just off to the left of the picture, but the modern infill development, great big stuff. And again, the problem with the yield was that they wanted to get very high returns on investment. It ended up sitting empty, but there are things you can still do by starting to just make it a bit of a cool, funky paint job on the outside. That starts to bring life to the street, and that starts to bring activity to the space. Again, this is another infill, which Swansea was flattened in the Second World War, so it's got a lot of these sort of dotted around in next to some of the more historic bits. So the historic high street's only sort of 50, 100 yards from this. Again, empty from when it was built, but put a pop-up a science gallery in there, and again brings a new activity into space, and that's the back of it. But you can also do them with little ones, and a lot of the creative sector's got lots to teach us about these sorts of things. They're very good at doing quick, fast, light, cheap. This was the very first one we ever did back in 1999, which was a pop-up art gallery with a local university, and just creating a white box in a space. You can see it's pretty narrow there, it's 4 or 5 meters wide, it's pretty narrow shop front, and turning that into a white box art gallery. Through to at the other end of the scale, you can spend a bit more money on them. This is one we've done recently, which is taking an empty vacant space in the creative quarter, which is to the north of Swansea, which is one of the few bits that the Luftwaffe missed. And again, it's a sort of modern development behind a historic facade, but the cafe was struggling because it was kind of, when the infill was done, it was built the wrong way round. It was inward facing rather than outward facing. So again, it was trying to think about, well, how can we convert that space to make it commercially vibrant and create some cafe space? Again, this is a pop-up. This is probably towards the higher end in terms of the amount you'd spend on a pop-up, but you just show the sorts of things that you can do to invigorate these sorts of spaces and turn it into a cafe area. Sometimes they are literally white box, wheel the stuff in and wheel it out again. There's a plant shop, which is a pop-up again in an empty space, and that's working well in Swansea's Union Street. This was a refill shop with a local environment centre, again in the very, very quick, fast, easy to do, very effective, and just brings a new use into a space. We've got a dementia hub, which is working brilliantly with the minister visiting them there for looking at, kind of giving advice and support for people who've got family members suffering from dementia. And of course, the clientele for this are the people who are the carers for the people with dementia generally. So they've got disposable income, they're coming in, they're then going next door, spending some money in a shop. This is in a mall in Swansea, so there's very high land values. And the question came up earlier on about absentee landlords, or sort of not necessarily absentee, but landlords who are based externally, perhaps in London or maybe even further afield. This is a huge managing agent, kind of multinational corporation that runs this, and they responded very, very positively to the idea of pop-up spaces. And again, we did that with the university, and we've done gallery spaces, pop-up art shop. That was the former Disney store in Swansea, and a craft store there. And then the fifth one, which is the fifth principle, which is it's great having all those spaces, but you've got to think about what happens in between those spaces, and that's the point, that public spaces are accessible and inviting. And the key things there are about thinking about how people actually want to use and linger in those spaces. And you can sort of see there, I can't imagine that's particularly comfy to sit on, but it's obviously a space that gets the sun, and it's a space where people want to sit. And so it's actually responding to that user experience. How do people want to use these spaces? Contrast it with these types of developments, which are these utterly soulless kind of public plazas that are created that at 99% of their lives are just utterly dead. Or this one, I bet you those benches cost an absolute fortune, but where are people actually sitting, and where's the user experience? People are actually sitting on the ledge behind it, because that's the space where they want to sit and make the world go by, and it's more comfortable, or whatever else it might be. Again, historic spaces, that's perhaps at the more kind of sexy end of the spectrum. That's outside the Parthenon in Rome. But again, those public plazas and historic places have created that, and they've had 100 years, 200 years, in some cases like this one, centuries, to actually work out their urban form and how they should function, and how they operate with people. The second thing then is that what's happened to a lot of our historic spaces is that historic towns are generally not built with cars in mind, because they were built long before cars existed. And this is a cartoon by Carl Gilg, which was done for one of the Scandinavian local authorities and governments rather, and sort of goes to exemplify what many of our townscapes are like now, is that you might as well have a chasm in between with these narrow crossing points, which are very rickety and dangerous, because we've given over so much of our space in towns to motor vehicles. And if we get that density right, if we get walkability right, if we make them people places, you don't then need the vehicles to do that. You will often get lots of pushback from small retailers, particularly, saying, this is our lifeblood. There's actually quite a lot of interesting information out there which has been researched now, which shows that actually in the vast majority of instances, particularly small retailers, tend to vastly overestimate the degree to which they're actually reliant on car-borne trade. It's usually far lower in reality than they actually think it is. There's quite a few interesting studies that have been done on that in a variety of places. If you look at some of the French town squares, and again, a lot of the French sort of small towns and villages, historic villages, where they've got this, you can see there where you go in your car, all the road markings start to disappear, and you have to slow down, and that starts to make you pay attention to what's around me. And that they have these sorts of central spaces, and where you can't really tell where the pavement ends and where the road begins, and they become more people-focused places. You can still take your car there, you can still stop, but you have to slow down, and it's this people space. This is in Tours in France again, and you can see it's a bit dark because it was under the canopy on a very bright day, but in the middle of the road, you've got this boulevard of trees with a flower market. And this is a really big, wide plaza, but on either side, you can see the cars just about on either side parked. And actually the carriageways there, and this is right smack bang in the middle of a large sort of city. And the roadway is pretty narrow there. And again, it's because there's pedestrian priority, and the cars just have to take their time. You're in the middle of town here, you're going to have to slow down. It's going to take you a while to go through, because this is a people space. And that's one of the things we've forgotten and lost in a lot of places in the UK, even our historic town centres where we've prioritised cars. And there's lots of people making lots of effort to do that. And you can see here, this is a pretty expensive one that was done in the north of England, and this was one of the busiest roads that went through on the road to London, and at relatively large expense. A guy, the late Ben Hamilton Bailey, did a scheme here which is about making a much more people space. You can see the cyclists, it's easy to cross the road. All those road markings are disappearing, and it just becomes a space which is still allowing cars through, but it's much more of a people space. Again, you can see there's a European example. It's actually downgrading the traffic, shared surfaces, just getting people to start getting used to, this is cycling space, this is walking space. You can take your car through, but it's got to be slow. The pandemic taught us a lot about this as well. We closed roads. We allowed people to put tables and chairs out on streets, and lots of places, certainly in the European context, have kept that. In the UK, we've tended just to switch them all back as soon as we're able to and reopen them to cars. But actually on the continent, they've permanently closed lots of those roads, because they can see that the commercial vitality is far, far better by making them people spaces. spaces. And if you don't believe you can do it, the thing that I get sick of hearing is, oh, well, it's all very welcome to do that, but we're not insert city here, Paris or whatever it might be. This is New York. And this is some of the highest land values on the planet. And this is car-loving city centre, and that's before and after on the left and right. Janet Sadiq Khan, when she became the mayor of New York, said we're going to start downgrading traffic and make people spaces. And they just closed Times Square, and they put tables and chairs out. They did it incredibly cheaply. They did it with buckets of floor paint, and they did barriers to stop the cars, and it was commercially overwhelmingly successful. And if they can do that with the land values there, you can do it anywhere in the world. So instead of saying, oh, we're not you, New York, it's saying, no, New York is not you. And if they can do it in New York, you can do it anywhere. It's another example. If you look at the slip road on the right, and again, they just closed it. They could put tables and chairs in, really cheap and easy to do, and it makes it people space. Loads of pop-up stuff you can do with grass. You can do potted plants just to start softening spaces, to soften the concrete with pop-up parks, those sorts of things. Building parklets and sort of taking over 1 or 2 parking spaces with a bit of timber decking, getting people sitting out into public spaces. Again, that one's in New York, but you see that a lot on the continent. A lot of that was done here in the pandemic, and again, a lot of it's been taken away since, which is a very regressive step. We should be thinking about how do we make these sorts of things permanent, and again, how do we make it easy? How do we make it spaces pleasant to be in? It's in Old Orleans in south of Paris. You can see they've got fountains, and this is a public square. This is a modern development in amongst a historic town centre. And underneath this is a multi-storey car park. But at the surface level, what they've done is created a public plaza, and you have to go down a ramp and negotiate tight corners if you want to park your car, because they've said this is people space, and they've put fountains in, and it's a lovely space, and there's cafes surrounding it and places where you can sit and watch the world go by. And that's just to show that adults play just as much as the kids do. And I'll finish off with a few things that we've done in pop-up urbanism just to activate public spaces. Again, this is Uplands in Swansea, near where I live, just around the corner. This is a normal car-dominated space. That's what it normally looks like. And once a month, we put a street market in there. We close the road. It becomes people's space, and it's phenomenally successful for commercial and social vitality. This is another one that we do, which is in Dylan Thomas Square in Swansea Town Centre. Again, that's what it normally looks like. It's quiet, it's off footfall lines, there's nobody really there. That building you can see in the background's a pub restaurant. I stick a market in it, and it's full of people. It's got vitality, and again, we do those once a month. We're just experimenting with doing those once weekly at the moment, and again, it just brings vitality spaces. One in Mumbles, again, it's a car park right smack bang in the middle of the historic village there in Mumbles. Once a month, stick a street market in there, and it just brings the space to life and actually brings footfall. And here's a modern one which was done in Port Talbot, again, another one of these kind of public plazas, very nice, smart, clean lines, but most of the time looks like that with hardly anybody in it by the bus station. And once a month you stick a market in, and it just builds that footfall and that kind of interest and density. And we've researched this, we've done this with a local university, and we found from doing things like pop-up street markets is that surveying the people at them is that 67% of them wouldn't otherwise have come to that location if it weren't for the pop-up activity, and in this case the markets being on. 70% of the people who came said that they will be spending money whilst they're there in other shops and prep cafes and whatever it might be that is not the market. So in other words, the stuff that's there when the market's not on. And of those people, 20% of them will spend on average between 10 and 24 quid each in those spaces. So again, not the market spaces in the surrounding cafes, retailers or whatever. And for 77% of respondents, it had positively impacted on their perception of those places and made them think about it as being a place they would like to go to and visit again. I'm out of time, and I wasn't going to dwell on this, but the one that's missing there, and the one that we really need to grapple with, and it's trickier in historic town centres, is we also need to be re-greening our town centres. And a lot of the time we get caught into the idea of greening and green infrastructure as being things like green walls and green roofs, and those are lovely and they're great. But actually they can also be very simple things like this, which are rain gardens, which is when you're doing that bit of traffic calming and just putting a pinch in the road just to narrow it, slow the traffic down. Instead of filling it with concrete, fill it with plants and a sustainable urban drainage system, which just absorbs water runoff, so that we start to green our town centres and do that. We could spend ages talking about greening and how we do that. I could do a whole 15-20 minutes on that, but I won't dwell on that today. But if anybody wants to talk about that, I'm happy to answer questions on that later. If anybody else is interested in the other things we do, we're at Urban Foundry on Twitter, and we're urbanfoundry.co.uk. But that's just really a bit of a whirlwind about why our towns and cities sort of work in the way, and how they should work in the way that dwells on those sort of 5 principles that makes them sustainable town. And to finish off, really, is to say that our historic town centres have a lot to teach us about those sorts of things, because the ones that have managed to sustain themselves, that haven't been given over to 4-lane motorways going through the middle of them, that haven't had that out-of-town development built smack bang next to them, which has drawn all the trade away, they generally actually showed us throughout the pandemic that they've survived and thrived relatively well, because they've tended to be based on those sustainability principles, which are the ones that have really struggled. They've been the more modern town centres where actually the land values are extremely high, where they're very heavily car dominated, where they're not walkable. And so actually there's a lot, it shows that there's a lot to teach us on from historic town centres. Of course, I'm generalising, there's always exceptions to the rule, but those are the sort of core principles we should be thinking about and remembering when we're thinking about how we make for sustainable towns and make great places. Thanks very much for asking me, and back over to you, Nell.